Hey YouTube, on this segment of Just the Tips, we already started on this Switch Pro install on this Ford Raptor. To get you guys caught up on where we are at, we already removed the battery box so we can get more room to access everything. We installed the SDHQ Switch Pro mount, and then we started to route the main loom following the factory wiring path, which goes through right here, going to these 4 Baja Designs LP6s, as well as this light bar.
So this is the harness for the switch panel, and it has to make it from the engine compartment all the way into the interior. One of the best locations that we've been told is this rubber grommet, which is actually very thick. All right, having fun fishing the switch wire harness through the firewall. So we've pulled out the grommet that's behind the fuse box here. We're going to make an incision through that nipple grommet. It's a double-sided grommet, and then we're going to push through to the other side. We did use a borescope to show us that there is a clean path past this because your AC fan is behind it.
All right, so after we pulled that grommet out, we cut that nipple. As you can see, we fed the wire for the harness to the switch panel through the grommet, and now it's in the passenger side of the car. What we're going to do next is coming inside here. We have this wire fed through inside over here, and we're going to feed this wire up the A-pillar, through the headliner, and up to where the switch panel will be.
You can see here that it's almost a straight shot from the fuse box straight out to the back of the vehicle. The step with this will be to go up the A-pillar and over to the center console. And yes, you can tell by the kit, we're going to have some extra wire. So we have 2 choices. We can shorten it, or we have enough room in here that we can coil it up and keep it out of the way.
So where does it come through on the back end?
The grommet feeds through on the back side of this the firewall, and then it just snakes along the AC fan. So this is where it comes through from the firewall. It's a tight little area, but you can actually feed it through. Once I got the wire through, I actually have a nice long little tool, like a little hook, lets me grab the wire and pull it through. Because it'll bunch up in here when you push it through. It just kind of piles in. So you just have to help it all the way through. Once you're to here, I think it gets a lot easier to feed it through the interior. Now, one of the things that we're installing with this as well is another fuse relay box by LVJ. And some people might think, well, it's redundant because you have a lot of amperage outputs from the Switch Pro. But the advantage to this is we have serviceable relay modules. So these lights can generate a lot of heat. That's kind of an expensive system. These are a lot cheaper to replace. These are under $20 a piece when they go bad in 5 to 10 years. So far, we've started to line up all the inputs for these lights. We're going to follow the factory harness. Obviously, you can see we already have the battery tray out. I'm going to use a big piece of shrink tube to help coordinate it through here, so that way it cleans up the look a little bit. I also have another plug here that doesn't match the Deutsch connectors, and that's for a bar light down here. One of the things this customer wants is he wants the amber lights, the amber circuit for this, to activate with the parking lights. This, I believe, I haven't tested it yet. I believe this, the blue and gray right here is actually the parking light circuit. And we'll confirm that with a light probe later before we do the final install, but our trigger point goes back to the Switch Pro, and we'll tie into this. and the wire will fish through with everything to help disappear it. We're leaving the fuse box out because it gives me more room to deal with the harnesses going back and forth from the front of the truck to the switching components. Okay, so this whole project started with the Switch Pro SP9100, and the customer bought this mounting bracket, which is actually really nice because it's not a universal mounting bracket. There's a series of hardware. It comes with very clear and precise instructions on how to install it. This is a 15mm plastic cap nut, and then down here is a 10mm fender washer, or fender nut, or collar nut. And those two things loosen up, and this bracket almost literally slides into place. There's a reinforcement bracket here that helps support it to keep it off your ignition modules. The only modification I had to do was it came with hardware, and there was an issue with the hardware, so I had to change this bolt. But the kit should provide with no changes whatsoever, but I did change it so that way the washer was on top, because it came with the fat fender washer and a standard washer to be used underneath. But when I used it, it compressed a little bit, so I added a secondary washer to help even out the way it mounts into the car. And then these screws actually come in. They're pretty easy to go in. I can't show you now because it's installed. This side is open just like this side, which means you can start the nut on the screw, slide it in place, drop this screw in, hold the nut on the back. The nuts that were provided with this kit have spider washers that are mounted to them, which means they spin with the nut, they spin separate from the nut. So you can install it, the spider nut creates traction, and it gives a positive connection to the board, and a simple screwdriver will tighten it up. I think just by holding the nut by hand was all I needed to get it started. And then once those spider washers get dug in, they do the rest. This is the grommet that we cut off the wire where the light wire loom passed through. And you saw how thick it was, so I'm just going to show it to you up close. You can see that my initial cut was not very clean. It takes a lot of chomping to get through, and you can see exactly how thick it is. Once it's off, it's real easy to clean up with a razor blade, or what I use is something like this, which is a flush cut electronics trimmer. Anything that's not flush cut is going to leave these raised marks. It doesn't really affect the sealing of everything, but it's just an aesthetics thing because you can see it when it passes through when you go to look for it. Just so you understand the basics of relays, this is essentially the relay that's in the Ford. They look a lot like this. There are different configurations of relays, but the basics of it are very simple. This little part of the graph shows a motor mechanism. It's basically creating an electromagnet, and it makes the switch between the two ports. This is your battery point in, and that's your battery point out. The reason you use relays is to do load reduction on your main switches or electronics. And it's very important because you're going to see some of the redundant systems that we're doing with this vehicle, because one switching component is solid state and the other one is a replaceable mechanical relay. So the reason why I'm pointing this out to you, in the Switch Pro, there's a wire that's labeled for ignition. So you saw where this wire goes through and how it'll connect to the control module. And the reason that we're running this is this is the factory port plug that plugs into the Switch Pro. And this one's labeled ignition. Essentially, the reason why I pointed out the lesson on the relay is this gets turned on and off through the ignition system. If you do not connect this to something that provides power and turns off power, this will stay on all the time, and then you're going to have battery drain issues. The minute you hook this up, it activates a component in this control module to act like a relay. So when the ignition is off, all your circuits turn off and you don't have to worry about your power drain. I like to ensure that all connection points to important components like ignition are inside the cab, or at least in a drier environment than an engine bay. Any connection that you make and can't ensure seals need to be done in a place that you know can stay dry. So what I did was I have a sleeving here to help protect the wire. And because it's a fiber, I used clear shrink tube on the ends to ensure that it doesn't fray, because it will. And then I married the pass-through through the grommet like all the rest. Now I married, there are several different cheats to when you're fishing wires through. I use it's a baling wire line that's stainless steel, so it's pretty stiff. I doubled it over so it's a nice fluted pipe, kind of, as it were. And to get things through is really a two-person operation, because to get from here past the fan, you're dealing with about a foot of space that you can't get your hands into, which is, if you remember that hook that I showed you, why that's so important. You can use any solid wire from your house, 14 gauge wire. I actually use that from time to time. I have a piece of 12 gauge. And you can use electrical tape or anything else, and you marry it to the wire, and it basically acts as a push to go through. It keeps the wire in a straight line and helps you have a little control with what's going on. Now, I already had a little help, but here's my married wire, and it's going to come through in the same place as the main wire that I came through. One of the things that this has to connect to is underneath the dash. And when you take the dash apart, you're going to come across a module. Online, when you look up this part number, they called it a start-stop computer box control module. The key is the wiring diagrams match. Labels sometimes can be different from manual to manual, so don't always rely on one source for how they label things. What you're looking at here is the back of that control module plug. This is what plugs into it. You have to unplug it to get to take the dash apart. That little white and brown wire is ignition. That turns the components on and off from your ignition source. The reds are battery power, black is typically ground, and then the others are control wires. We'll confirm this before we actually make the splice. So here's the loom for these lights traveling into the car, into the engine bay. And I have the zip tie you saw here earlier, and then I have a secondary zip tie here earlier. They don't need to be too tight. Like I said, they can trap a lot of heat. The key thing is they're just staying in place, because when the car gets running again, the wires are going to mold into whatever direction they like to go. So these are just help guide how the wires form into the car. So I've cut my lead out and I've put in 4-pin connectors. Rule of thumb, if you're taking wires out, there's a saying that I've always known, which is boys go home. So you want to make sure that the gender of the wires and the connectors are going the correct direction. So the input is coming from this side, which is a female connector, and everything traveling facing that direction will be a male connector. So that's why I have 4 males here, 4 females here. Now when I cut into this wire, it's not a straight wire. There's a shielding wrap, and then there's a shielding ground. Just so you're not surprised when you open it, these are actually just protecting the wires. Some cases they're used for high interference, like if you have something that's creating frequency, like near radio, and this will help keep from interfering with the radio. In our application, it's not being used, but I just wanted to show it to you. So the Switch Pro requires a switch input. Like the relay that I talked about earlier, it needs to have an activating wire to activate all the relays, to turn everything on. This was that control module that we showed earlier as well. And I stripped the wires back on this. Originally, this cloth came all the way to here. And the reason why I peel it back is when I do a splice in, the kit comes with the 3M splice kits, which I don't like because they technically damage the wire when they go on. They can vibrate over time, they can come loose, create all sorts of problems. Since this wire is so important to how the car turns on and off, I try and respect the wire as much as possible. So what I did was I removed a little bit of sheathing and then twisted my wire on and then soldered it. Because the original wire is pretty thin, you don't want to overheat the wire because it can damage the wire. And if you notice, I'm not near where this plugs into this connector. Part of that is down the line. You ever have your vehicle serviced? This is a part that comes on and off the car frequently. You don't want this to be disturbed where you have a tap in. So this connector that Ford uses is a Molex connector. This comes off pretty easy. I mean, I use my fingers just to take it off. And then you can use a cotter pin, a thin cotter pin, split it in two. And there's a tab back there which releases this. And that lets you pull it out. Now with it out like this, after the solder, I'll be able to put on a piece of shrink tube to seal it. And then I'll plug it back in when it's all set. When I put the cloth tape back on, try not to use electrical tape because there's a lot of gooey in it. And as the truck gets hot over the summer, that gets everywhere. Friction tape is very similar. Hockey tape is a pretty good alternative. And if you have access to the factory tape, go ahead and reuse that and make sure that you come back down to the same point how the factory had it. The thing is, when you're taping, make sure you tape in this lead wire an inch or so. Again, vibration, serviceability, it keeps from this being damaged because once the tape is on, it really secures that wire to this wire to prevent issues down the line. Okay, here we are with the sealing dash inside the Ford Raptor. These are just held in with pressure clips. And that's the magnet for the headliner. Once you get started, you can work your way around. And one by one, they're push tabs that lock all these electrical connectors into place. Sometimes they're on the side, sometimes they're on the top. This is push button. You can see as I start to disconnect how it'll roll around. That one comes undone. And then we can get the two in the back. This is what it looks like when it comes out. Each connector has its own style and direction lock. And I've already installed the Switch Pro control module into this unit already. One of the things that you'll find out, these little LED plugs, well, they're actually the whole thing. They kind of hinge off this little point right there. So when you put them in, they really have to rock back before they settle into place. This one's more of a problem when you're installing the Switch Pro controller, only because its lead is so short and intertwined. I just found it easier for whatever reason to take it out this time. But you can see the tabs, there's no interlocking device or no screws or anything like that. So when you go to reinstall it, because our Switch Pro is installed, it's the opposite. Start in the back, make sure you get solid connections. You can kind of let the wires hang. And there are guide tracks to all of these, so they can only go in one way. So if you hit resistance, do what I'm doing, stop and take a look around, see why it's not going together. No locking spring there. Hear the click. Hear the click. Start in the back, and then it's literally just and the upper dash is reinstalled. If you remember, we ran the loom from the lights across the factory harness, and we're still in the engine bay here. I've already gone ahead and terminated my lines, and I used these connectors. We got them from McMaster Car, and the main thing is whatever connector device you use, it's all rated based on cable. The reason I like connectors like this is they're very easy to release the pins. The tool I use to make the crimps is something that you can get pretty much anywhere. Not like Ace Hardware, Home Depot kind of tool, but you can go online and any of the electronics companies that sell connector points, connector parts, will sell a crimp like this. But I like to use connectors because if I change or modify the system in the future, I'm just releasing pins and reorganizing how they work. If I were to solder or terminate all my connections, anytime I want to change something that I've previously installed or somebody else wants to change in the future, they have to cut wires. And every time you cut wires, you're losing length. So that's why I like connectors, because it's very modular. The other thing too is you have no idea what Ford tech or any other tech will do in the future, and they might need to disconnect, like where the battery tray is, they might need to service something, and this will save you money in the long run because you're not paying hours for them to cut and resplice wires. Again, problems with shortening in the future. And when it comes to it, like this is my lead that I prepared off the Switch Pro, and this is feeding the amber lights off my front, and it's literally that easy to service, to plug and unplug. And then the LVJ relay module, the outputs will be coming into here. And so again, every time the battery tray has to be serviced, it's a disconnection point that's easy to use. These are sealed connectors, and again, saves you time and money in the future. These are all the switching components, and I'll be using a Deutsch connector just because I have 6 out that I'm using, and there'll be 6 into the LVJ relay terminal. And the Deutsch connector just makes a really nice tight package because they have a 6-pin connector I can use. Unfortunately, Deutsch connectors are, the tooling to use Deutsch connectors is a little more expensive. And these you can get in various configurations, 3, 6, and otherwise. Something that you'll notice too though, the lines coming out to the wires are a lot bigger gauge than what's coming here. So keep that in mind when you're buying your connectors. A few key notes before you get started with electrical systems. One is trying to have a good plan, be somewhat organized, and labeling is very important. Neatness, when you put things together, is also critical. Know your tooling, know your connections. If you're using butt connectors, just realize that butt connectors are one-time use. If you have to change them in the future, you are shortening wires. People use 3M tap cube or tap connectors. People use 3M tap connectors. Keep in mind that when you use those, vibration can cause preliminary failure, and it can also damage wires, the strands in the wires. So here we are finishing up our install on the LP6s on the front of this Ford Raptor. I showed you previously how we loomed through the system. As you can see in the front of the truck, that pretty much all the wires are hidden. So it looks like a factory install, which is what I like to go for. And then as we move into the cabin, where we plug into this relay module, we just used a Metri pack. It's a sealed connector kit that comes down here, and they tie into the output of these relay systems. They're triggered inbound by what we're using in this particular application are 6-pin Deutsch connectors. And the reason why I like using the Deutsch connectors is they, outside of the expensive tooling to get started, and they have a couple different variations, so there's some options if you choose to go Deutsch connector directions. But the inputs coming off the Switch Pro 9100 has multiple outputs. So I was able to pin all the outputs the same, and as I use 2 Deutsch 6-pin Deutsch connectors with 1 output into this switching relay here. And the advantage to that is it lets me modify and change which pins are triggering which relays in here for future use. Again, keeping things modular for me, for applications like this, are critical, again, because you might decide in the future that you want to change something, upgrade something, and you want to be able to have room to modify in the future without too much modification. There are 2 LP4s in the back of this truck. They're tied together and they basically string along, just like in the front, they string along the entire factory harness. But because the factory never ran harnesses in and around this engine or on top of the engine, the harness actually comes all the way down the frame rail, up and over the front suspension, under the radiator, back into here. Again, we're missing all the heat that this motor generates during any kind of use. And because it's tucked in with the factory harness, that means if you're going to go off-roading, you've got plenty of clearance for those wires without damage. Thanks for watching. Like the video, subscribe to our channel, comment any suggestions, and check out the description for links to social media. Thank you.